At 0832 hours on October 12, 1944, Staff Sergeant James Callahan stood in the maintenance depot 3,000 yards below Highway 65, watching three M4A3 Sherman tanks begin an ascent they probably wouldn't complete. The morning air smelled like diesel exhaust and mountain pine. Engine sounds echoed off cliff faces. The road ahead climbed 1,800 feet in 4 miles. Average grade, 8%. Maximum grade in 3 sections, 32 degrees. The kind of numbers that made mechanics nervous and tankers dead. Lieutenant David Morrison commanded the lead Sherman. 26 years old, Michigan, 7 months in Italy. Competent driver, good tactical mind. His tank weighed 33 tons combat loaded. Ford GAA V8 engine. 450 horsepower at sea level. Except they weren't at sea level. They were at 4,000 feet elevation in the northern Apennines, and altitude changed everything. Callahan watched Morrison's Sherman climb the first 200 yards. Engine note steady, transmission in 3rd gear. Speed approximately 15 miles per hour. Then the grade increased from 8% to 18%. Morrison downshifted to 2nd gear. Engine RPMs climbed from 1,200 to 1,500. The tank slowed to 12 mph, but maintained momentum. 400 yards into the climb, the grade hit 24%. Morrison dropped to 1st gear. The engine screamed at 1,800 RPM. The tank slowed to 8 mph, then 6 mph, then 4 mph. White steam erupted from the engine deck. The temperature gauge had passed 230 degrees, coolant boiling, engine seizing. Morrison's Sherman stopped. Just sat there on a 32-degree grade with German artillery observers watching from Monte Battaglia 4,000 yards north. The 2nd Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Frank Weber, made it 200 yards before losing power completely. Weber was from Ohio, 31 years old, mechanic before the war. He understood engines. He knew what was happening. The Ford GAA couldn't generate enough power at altitude to pull 33 tons up that grade. Physics didn't care about determination. Weber's tank rolled backward 50 feet before the crew regained control with emergency braking. The tank stopped. Engine temperature, 240 degrees. Power output, insufficient. The 3rd Sherman's commander, Corporal Thomas Hayes, watched both failures from the base of the climb. Hayes was 22, California, smart enough to recognize a losing situation. He refused to attempt the climb, kept his tank at the bottom, kept his crew alive for another day. German artillery opened fire at 0837. The first round hit 30 yards short. The second round hit 20 yards over. The third round landed between Morrison's and Weber's stopped tanks. Shrapnel tore through Morrison's engine deck. His driver, Private Kenneth Walsh, took shrapnel through the open hatch. Killed instantly. Weber's bow gunner, Corporal Anthony Rizzo, died from shrapnel penetration through the hull. Hayes's loader, Private James McKinney, was killed by fragments during the retreat. Major Richard Holbrook ordered withdrawal at 0841. All 3 Shermans returned to base under tow. Morrison's tank with a dead driver, Weber's tank with a dead bow gunner. Hayes's tank intact but useless. 3 tankers dead. 0 tactical progress. 0 elevation gained. The mountain had won. Callahan watched the recovery operation from the motor pool. Watched crews extract bodies from tanks, watched medics load casualties onto transport trucks, watched commanders fill out casualty reports. Walsh, Kenneth J. Rizzo, Anthony M. McKinney, James R. All killed attempting a climb the tanks couldn't physically accomplish. This was the problem the Fifth Army couldn't solve. Between them and the Po Valley lay 60 miles of northern Apennines. Mountains that climbed from sea level to 6,000 feet in less than 20 miles. Roads carved into cliffsides. hairpin turns, grades exceeding 35 degrees in some sections, and German defensive positions on every ridge, every hilltop, every defendable piece of vertical terrain. The Fifth Army's plan required armor support. Sherman tanks climbing mountain roads to support infantry assaults on German strongpoints. But Sherman tanks weren't designed for mountains. They were designed for flat French countryside, for open Belgian farmland, for gentle rolling hills in North Africa. The M4A3 Sherman used a Ford GAA V8 engine, 450 horsepower, excellent power output at sea level where air density provided sufficient oxygen for complete fuel combustion. But the Apennines weren't sea level. Fighting was happening at 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet, sometimes 6,000 feet elevation. At altitude, atmospheric pressure dropped. Air density decreased. Less oxygen meant incomplete combustion, less power. The physics were brutal and quantifiable. A Sherman producing 450 horsepower in Naples produced approximately 320 horsepower at 5,000 feet. A 29% power loss. That deficit killed tankers. Combine altitude power loss with a 32-degree grade, and the equation became impossible. A Sherman weighing 33 tons required approximately 60% of maximum engine output just to maintain forward momentum on a 32-degree climb. At sea level, 450 horsepower provided adequate power. At 5,000 feet, 320 horsepower wasn't enough. The math didn't work. The tanks couldn't climb. Between October 12th and October 28th, 1944, the 1st Armored Division lost 17 Sherman tanks attempting mountain road climbs. Not from German fire, from mechanical failure, engines seizing from overheating, transmissions burning out from excessive load, brakes failing on descent when crews tried to back down after stalling. 17 tanks, 22 killed, 34 wounded. 0 successful climbs, 0 tactical objectives achieved. The Fifth Army had 143 Sherman tanks in Italy, but those tanks couldn't reach the fight, couldn't support infantry, couldn't suppress German positions. Mountains made armor irrelevant. German intelligence reports from late October documented American failures. 14th Army analysts noted, American armor attempts on mountain positions continue to fail mechanically. No tactical adjustments needed. Terrain provides adequate defense. The Germans were right. Terrain was defeating American armor more effectively than German guns. Infantry companies attacked German mountain positions without tank support. Casualties were catastrophic. 3rd Battalion, 88th Infantry Division lost 117 men, taking a single ridge on October 20th. The attack should have included armor support, should have had Shermans suppressing German machine gun nests. But the tanks couldn't reach the ridge, couldn't climb the roads. Infantry went alone. 117 casualties for 400 yards of elevation gain. Fifth Army Command understood the problem. Major General Lucian Truscott issued orders on October 23rd. All units will continue mountain offensive operations. Armor will provide support where terrain permits. The order acknowledged reality. Armor couldn't reach most objectives. Infantry would have to take mountains alone. The brutal math of Sherman mountain climbs was documented, quantified, and predictable. Tank begins ascent at standard engine operating temperature, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Grade starts at 8%. Driver maintains 3rd gear. Speed, 15 ms. Engine RPMs, 1200. Temperature holds steady. Grade increases to 18%. Driver downshifts to 2nd gear. Engine RPMs increase to 1500. Speed drops to 12 mph. Temperature rises to 190 degrees, still within operating parameters. Grade jumps to 24%. Driver downshifts to first gear. Engine RPMs climb to 1800. Speed drops to 8 mph. Temperature rises to 200 degrees, approaching warning threshold. Grade reaches 32 degrees. Driver maintains first gear. Throttle at maximum. Engine RPMs at 2200. Speed drops to 6 mph, then 4 mph, then 2 mph. Temperature climbs to 220 degrees, 230 degrees, 240 degrees. Coolant boils at 212 degrees. Steam vents from overflow. Engine loses power. Tank stops. Momentum lost. Driver attempts to restart. Engine seized or refuses ignition. Tank sits motionless on 32-degree grade. Crew has two options: abandon tank and walk down, or attempt reverse descent under tow. Reverse descent presented its own nightmare. 33 tons rolling backward down a mountain road. Emergency braking required. Brake systems designed for forward deceleration, not sustained rearward control on extreme grades. Brake fluid overheats. Brake pads glazed. Brake fade. At 240 degrees, hydraulic brake fluid boils. Brakes fail completely. 33-ton tank accelerates backward. Multiple hairpin turns. Cliff edges with 1,000-foot drops. 4 Sherman tanks were lost to brake failure during descent between October 12th and October 25th. 11 crew members killed. 7 wounded. The tanks that survived the failed climb died during retreat. Major Holbrook filed a report to Division Command on October 26th. The language was clinical, but desperate. Armor support in mountain terrain currently impossible with existing equipment. Request alternative tactical plans or mechanical solutions. Current casualty rate unsustainable. Division response arrived October 27th. Solutions unavailable. Continue attempts with maximum crew safety precautions. The Army had no answer. Engineering had no answer. The technical manuals had no answer. Sherman tanks couldn't climb mountains. That was the reality. Infantry would have to win the mountain campaign without armor. And infantry was dying at rates that made October 1944 one of the bloodiest months in the Italian theater. Staff Sergeant James Callahan was 24 years old. Farm kid from Otoe County, Nebraska. 4,800 acres of wheat. He'd grown up maintaining John Deere tractors on his family's farm. Model D tractors, Model A tractors. He'd learned engine maintenance from his father, Robert Callahan. Learned fuel systems, ignition timing, carburetor adjustment. Learned how to make tractors pull heavy loads up the one hill on their property. Callahan enlisted in February 1942 at Fort Riley, Kansas. Army needed mechanics. Callahan qualified easily. He'd been rebuilding tractor engines since he was 14. Basic training. Mechanic training. Assignment to 1st Armored Division in April 1942. 18 months maintaining M4 Sherman tanks, North Africa, Sicily, mainland Italy. He knew the Ford GAA engine intimately. Knew its specifications, knew its limitations, knew that 450 horsepower at sea level dropped to 320 at altitude. Knew that power loss killed tankers. Callahan had maintained all 17 Shermans that failed mountain climbs. Had signed off their pre-mission inspections, had checked their oil, coolant, fuel systems, had certified them mechanically sound, and watched them fail anyway. Watched Morrison's tank fail. Watched Weber's tank fail. Watched Hayes refuse to try. Listened to drivers describe identical symptoms: power loss, overheating, momentum failure, 17 separate incidents. But Callahan understood something command didn't recognize. This wasn't 17 separate mechanical failures. This was one systemic problem manifesting 17 times. The problem? Fuel-air mixture optimized for sea-level atmospheric pressure failing at altitude. Callahan kept thinking about his father's tractors back in Nebraska. The farm was mostly flat, but the western section had one hill, 220 feet elevation gain over half a mile. Not steep by mountain standards, but steep enough that pulling loaded grain wagons required more power than the tractors normally produced. His father had modified the fuel delivery system, richer fuel mixture, advanced ignition timing, temporary power boost when climbing the hill. The modification worked. Had worked for 20 years on the Callahan farm. Young James had performed that modification hundreds of times between 1936 and 1941. Same principles. Internal combustion engine. Fuel, air, spark, timing. Get the mixture right, engine produces power. Get it wrong, engine fails. On the evening of October 28, 1944, Callahan lay in his bunk in the motor pool barracks. Sleep wouldn't come. He kept seeing Morrison's tank stopped on that grade. Kept seeing the steam erupting from the engine deck, kept seeing the body bags, and he kept thinking about his father's John Deere tractors, about carburetor jets, about distributor timing, about coolant boiling points. The Ford GAA V8 used 4 Stromberg carburetors, mechanical distributor, water-cooled, same basic principles as a John Deere. Different scale, different complexity, but same physics. What if the same modification that worked on a 27 horsepower tractor worked on a 450 horsepower tank engine? What if richer fuel mixture and advanced timing could compensate for altitude power loss? What if one farm kid's memory of Nebraska wheat harvests could solve a problem killing tankers in Italian mountains? Callahan made his decision that night. He'd modify a Sherman's fuel system, test it, see if farm tractor principles worked on Army tanks. The modification would violate every technical manual specification, would risk court-martial, would potentially destroy an engine. But tankers were dying, and Callahan knew how to make engines produce more power. What he did next would either save the Fifth Army's mountain offensive or end his military career. 1936. Otoe County, Nebraska. Callahan family farm. 4,800 acres of wheat stretching flat across the prairie. Young James Callahan was 16 years old, learning tractor maintenance from his father in a dirt floor equipment barn that smelled like engine oil and wheat chaff. Robert Callahan owned 4 John Deere Model D tractors, 27 horsepower each, designed for flat farmland, built to pull plows and harrows across level ground. They worked perfectly on 98% of the Callahan property. But the western section had terrain, one hill, 220 feet elevation gain over half a mile, 9% average grade. Not steep by mountain standards, steep enough to matter when pulling 3-ton grain wagons during harvest. The problem was mechanical and predictable. A John Deere Model D, producing 27 horsepower on flat ground, produced approximately 23 horsepower climbing that hill. Reduced power from increased load. The tractors could pull empty wagons up easily. Couldn't pull loaded wagons. The engine didn't have enough torque. Would strain, overheat, sometimes stall halfway up. Robert Callahan's solution was practical and unauthorized. He modified the carburetor and ignition timing when they needed extra power. Never told the John Deere dealer. Never consulted the manual. Just did what worked. Young James watched his father disassemble the carburetor. The main jet controlled fuel flow into the combustion chamber. Standard jet diameter, 0.062 inches. Robert drilled it out to 0.07 inches, 13% larger. More fuel flowed through on each intake stroke. Richer fuel-air mixture, more energy per combustion cycle. Then Robert adjusted the distributor. Standard timing, 14 degrees before top dead center. He rotated the distributor housing, advancing timing to 18 degrees, earlier spark. more complete combustion during the power stroke, better energy conversion. Combined effect. The tractor produced approximately 32 horsepower instead of 27, 18% increase, enough to pull loaded grain wagons up the hill. Cost. Increased fuel consumption, 20% higher. Increased engine temperature, 15 to 20 degrees hotter. Risk of engine damage if run too long at modified settings. Over 30 minutes continuous high load could damage pistons, crack cylinder heads, burn valves. Robert's protocol was strict. Standard settings for normal fieldwork. Modified settings only for the hill climb. Took 8 minutes to pull a loaded wagon up, then immediately return to standard settings. Never exceed the safe operating window. Young James performed this modification hundreds of times between 1936 and 1941. Learned the carburetor disassembly procedure until he could do it blindfolded. Learned to hear the difference in engine sound between standard and modified fuel mixture. Learned the principles. More fuel plus optimized timing equals more power, but at a cost. Use it temporarily, not continuously. Flash forward to October 28, 1944. Italy. Callahan lying in his bunk after watching 3 more tankers die attempting an impossible climb. Thinking about his father's John Deere tractors, thinking about carburetor main jets, thinking about distributor timing. The Ford GAA V8 used 4 Stromberg carburetors, 1 carburetor per 2 cylinders. Each carburetor had a main jet controlling fuel flow. Standard jet size, 0.055 inches. Mechanical distributor with vacuum advance. Standard base, timing, 10 degrees before top, dead center at idle, automatic advance to 28 degrees at high RPM. Same principles as the John Deere, different scale, different complexity, but same physics governing internal combustion. If his father's 13% jet enlargement produced 18% power increase on a 27 horsepower tractor, what would happen on a 450 horsepower tank engine? Callahan did the math in his head. Sherman at 5,000 feet, 320 horsepower. Sherman needed at sea level to climb 32-degree grades. 450 horsepower. Power deficit, 130 horsepower. Required increase, 41%. His father's modification achieved 18%. Could he double the effect? Could he push the Ford GAA to produce enough power to compensate for altitude loss? Only one way to find out. And it required braking regulations that could end his career. 0200 hours, October 29, 1944. Motor pool dark and quiet. Callahan alone with Tank USA 3064823. This Sherman had failed a climb on October 24th. Engine seized from overheating. Callahan had already rebuilt the engine over the past 3 days. New pistons, new rings, fresh timing chain, new head gaskets. The engine was mechanically perfect, ready for return to service. But Callahan was about to make it better. He started with the carburetors, 4 Stromberg units mounted on the intake manifold. 30 minutes to remove all 4. He worked by flashlight, hands black with grease. The motor pool smelled like diesel fuel and gun oil. Each carburetor disassembled into components: float bowl, venturi, main jet. The jets were brass, threaded into the carburetor body. Standard diameter, 0.055 inches. Callahan removed all 4 main jets, took them to the machine shop. The machine shop was empty at this hour. Drill press in the corner. Callahan selected a 0.065-inch drill bit. 18% larger diameter than standard, matching his father's tractor modification ratio. He chucked each jet into the drill press vise. Drilled carefully. Brass shavings curling away. Each jet enlarged from 0.055 to 0.065 inches. 40 minutes to drill all 4 jets. Clean them. Verify diameter with calipers. 0.065 inches. Perfect. Reassembled the carburetors. Reinstalled main jets. Adjusted mixture screws to compensate for increased fuel flow. Each carburetor required individual adjustment. The engine would run rich. That was intentional. Rich mixture meant more power. Reinstalled all 4 carburetors on the intake manifold. Torqued to specification. Connected fuel lines. Connected throttle linkages. First modification complete. Next. Distributor timing. The Ford GAA distributor sat at the rear of the engine. Mechanical unit with vacuum advance. Callahan loosened the distributor hold-down bolt. Rotated the distributor, housing clockwise. Advancing base timing from 10 degrees before top, dead center to 15 degrees. 5 degrees advance. Earlier ignition. More complete combustion. He tightened the hold-down bolt. Checked timing with a light. 15 degrees BTDC at idle. The automatic advance would push it to approximately 33 degrees at high RPM. 5 degrees more aggressive than standard. Third modification. Coolant mixture. Standard Army coolant was 50% ethylene glycol, 50% water. Boiling point, 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. Callahan drained the cooling system. Mixed new coolant, 65% ethylene glycol, 35% water. Higher glycol concentration raised the boiling point to 235 degrees, 23 degrees higher than standard. More temperature margin before coolant boiled and the engine seized. Total modification time, 2 hours, 40 minutes. The work was precise, mechanical, nothing dramatic. Just a farm kid applying lessons learned on Nebraska tractors to an Army tank engine. No documentation existed, no authorization, no approval from Motor Officer Captain Frank Harrison, no engineering review, just Callahan working alone in the dark, modifying government property in ways that violated 6 different technical manual specifications. If the modification failed and destroyed the engine, court-martial for destruction of government property. If the modification worked but was discovered before testing, court-martial for unauthorized alterations to combat equipment. If the modification worked and saved lives, maybe they'd overlook the regulations. Callahan closed the engine deck, cleaned his tools, walked away from Tank USA 3064823 at 04:45 hours. The Sherman looked identical to every other Sherman in the motor pool. Olive drab paint. White star on the hull. USA 3064823 stenciled on the side. But under that engine deck, everything was different. 4 carburetors flowing 18% more fuel. Distributor firing 5 degrees earlier. Coolant that could handle 23 degrees more heat. An engine that might produce enough power to climb mountains, or might destroy itself trying. Callahan went to his bunk. Didn't sleep. Just lay there thinking about carburetor jets and distributor timing and what would happen when someone actually tested this thing. Thinking about Morrison's dead driver. About Weber's dead bow gunner. About 17 tanks that couldn't do what the Army needed them to do. He'd either solved the problem or made it worse. Only way to know was test it. And testing required finding someone desperate enough or crazy enough to drive a tank with unauthorized modifications up a mountain that killed people. Morning formation, October 29th, 0730 hours. Callahan needed a test driver. Couldn't ask an officer. They'd refuse immediately, probably report him. Couldn't ask a by-the-book NCO. Same result. Needed someone with nothing left to lose. Someone angry enough about dead friends to risk regulations. Someone skilled enough to bail out if the engine exploded. Sergeant Michael Sullivan fit every requirement. Age 32. Boston. Professional driver before the war. Delivery trucks, Heavy construction equipment, new vehicles, new engines, knew how to handle equipment when things went wrong. Tank commander for 14 months. North Africa, Sicily, Italy, experienced, competent, and angry. Sullivan's tank had stalled on Highway 65 on October 18th. Failed climb, engine overheating, lost momentum at 22% grade. Tank rolled backward. Sullivan fought the controls, got it stopped after 50 yards. Thought everyone was okay. Then German artillery opened fire. One round landed 15 feet from his tank. Shrapnel penetrated the turret. His loader, Private Daniel McKay, died instantly. 20 years old. Chicago. Dead because a tank couldn't climb a hill. Sullivan blamed himself. Blamed the tank. Blamed the Army for sending them up grades that physics said were impossible. He'd requested transfer to infantry twice. Denied both times. Army needed experienced tank commanders. Didn't matter that the tanks couldn't reach the objectives. Callahan found Sullivan after formation. Motor pool area. Sullivan inspecting his replacement tank. New Sherman. Same specifications as the one that failed. Same engine, same limitations, same probability of failure. Callahan approached directly. No small talk. Sullivan wasn't the type. Sergeant, I might have a solution to the mountain problem. Sullivan looked at him, eyes tired. Army says there is no solution. Army doesn't know what I know about engines. What did you do? Modified the fuel system and timing on tank 3064823. Should give you 20 to 30% more power at altitude. Sullivan's expression didn't change. Should? You don't know? Won't know until someone tests it. What happens if the modification fails? Engine might seize. You'd need to bail out fast. What happens to you if I test this without authorization? Court-martial, probably. Sullivan stared at Callahan for 10 seconds. Then asked, why risk it? Callahan's response was simple and honest. Because I'm tired of watching tankers die trying to climb hills these machines can't handle. Because I know how to make engines produce more power. Because someone has to try something different. Sullivan processed this. Looked at his replacement tank, thought about McKay, thought about 17 failed climbs, thought about the mathematical certainty of another failure if nothing changed. When do we test it? This afternoon. Officer inspection is at 1400 hours. We go at 1500 after they clear out. Where? Highway 65. Same section that killed Morrison's crew. Sullivan nodded slowly. That's 8 miles from here. Motor officer will notice a tank missing. I'll tell him it's a maintenance test drive, checking the rebuilt engine. And if the modification works, then we figure out how to make command approve something they didn't authorize. Sullivan looked at Callahan. Farm kid, 24 years old, staff sergeant, risking court-martial to test a tractor modification on a tank. Either insane or the only person in 1st Armored Division actually trying to solve the problem. I'll bring my crew. If we're going to die testing your Nebraska tractor trick, might as well have witnesses. 1430 hours, October 29th. Officer inspection complete. Motor pool quiet. Callahan performed final checks on tank USA 3064823. Fuel level, full. 165 gallons of 80-octane gasoline. Oil level, full. Coolant level, full with modified 65% glycol mixture. He checked the carburetors one more time. 4 Stromberg units with enlarged main jets. Mixture screws adjusted. Checked the distributor. Timing advanced to 15 degrees. Checked the engine mounts. Torque specifications correct. Everything ready. Everything unauthorized. Everything potentially fatal. Sullivan's crew assembled. Sullivan commanding and driving. Corporal James Riley, bow gunner. Private First Class Anthony Marks, loader. Private David Chen, assistant driver. 4 men about to test modifications that violated regulations and possibly physics. None of them knew the specific technical details, just knew they were testing something unofficial, something that might let them climb mountains without dying. Callahan briefed Sullivan privately before they mounted up. Expected power increase, 25 to 35% at altitude. Expected temperature increase, 20 to 30 degrees higher than normal. Maximum sustained operation, approximately 20 to 25 minutes before excessive heat risk. If temperature exceeds 235 degrees, shut down immediately and bail out. Sullivan asked the critical question, "How confident are you this works?" Callahan gave the honest answer. "It worked on John Deere tractors in Nebraska." Sullivan stared at him. "This isn't a tractor. Internal combustion engine, same principles. You're insane." "Yeah." Sullivan climbed into the tank, settled into the driver's position. His hands moved across familiar controls: throttle, brake, transmission selector, steering levers, same controls as every other Sherman. But the engine under the deck was different, modified in ways the Army never approved, modified by a farm kid who remembered his father's tricks. Sullivan pressed the starter button. The Ford GAA fired. Rough idle, slightly rougher than standard. The modified fuel mixture made the engine run richer. Callahan heard it from outside. Sounded right. Sounded like his father's tractors when they were set up for heavy pulling. Temperature gauge, 170 degrees. Normal for a warm engine. RPM gauge, 1,000 RPM at idle. Standard. Sullivan released the brake. Engaged first gear. Tank USA 3064823 rolled forward. Out of the motor pool. Heading northwest toward Highway 65. Heading toward the mountain climb that killed 3 tankers 17 days ago. Heading toward a test that would either prove a Nebraska farm kid understood engines better than Army engineers, or kill 4 more men. Callahan watched the tank disappear around the maintenance depot corner. Didn't follow. Couldn't officially associate himself with an unauthorized test. All he could do was wait. Wait and hope that carburetor jets and distributor timing and modified coolant would do for a Sherman what they'd done for his father's tractors. Wait and hope that physics worked the same in Italy as it did in Nebraska. 15-20 hours, October 29th, 1944. Highway 65, 8 miles northwest of Motorpool. Tank USA 3064823 approaching the base of the climb section. The same location where Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman failed 17 days earlier. Same road, same grade, same physics that killed 3 tankers. Sullivan stopped the tank at the base. Engine idling at 1,000 RPM. Temperature gauge reading 180 degrees. Normal operating temperature. The road ahead climbed through mountain terrain. First section, gentle 8% grade for half a mile. Second section, 18% grade for 3/4 of a mile. Third section, 24% grade for half a mile. Final section, 32-degree grade for 400 yards. 1,800 feet total elevation gain. 4 miles of climbing that no Sherman had successfully completed since the 5th Army reached the Apennines. Scorch marks were still visible on the road surface. Morrison's tank had burned here. The engine overheated so severely that oil ignited on the engine deck. Left black carbon scoring on the pavement. Sullivan could see it through his periscope. His crew was silent. Riley in the bow gunner position, Marks in the loader position, Chen in the assistant driver's seat. Nobody spoke. Nothing to say. Either Callahan's modification worked, or they'd be walking back to base. Sullivan's hand rested on the transmission selector. First gear already engaged, his right foot on the accelerator. his left foot hovering over the brake. Standard tank driving position. Except nothing about this was standard. He keyed the intercom. "Listen up. We're testing modified engine configuration. Might work, might not. If I call engine failure, everybody out within 5 seconds. Understood?" 3 voices confirming. Understood. Sullivan released the brake. Tank rolled forward. Gentle acceleration. The grade started at 8%. Easy. The Sherman handled it without strain. Engine note steady. Transmission holding first gear. Speed 15 miles per hour. Temperature 180 degrees. No problems yet. First quarter mile. Grade still 8%. Sullivan maintained steady throttle. Engine RPM 1200. Speed 15 miles. Temperature 185 degrees. 5 degrees increase. Normal for a loaded climb. The modified fuel mixture was burning, producing power. No issues. Grade increased to 12%. Sullivan felt the load change. Pressed the accelerator slightly further. Engine response was immediate. Strong. The tank maintained speed at 12 mph. Engine RPM climbed to 1500. Temperature 190 degrees. 10 degrees higher than start. Still within safe parameters. Still climbing. Half mile into the ascent. Grade jumped to 18%. This was where standard Shermans started struggling. Where power output couldn't keep pace with load requirements. Where engines started overheating. Sullivan pushed the accelerator to 3/4 throttle. Engine RPM 1700. The Ford GAA was working harder now, pulling 33 tons up an 18% grade. Speed dropped to 10 mph, temperature 195 degrees, then 200 degrees. Riley's voice crackled over the intercom. "Temps climbing, Sarge." Sullivan, "I see it." But the tank kept moving, kept climbing. The engine wasn't losing power. The modified carburetors were flowing more fuel. The advanced timing was burning it more efficiently. The combination was working. The Sherman was producing more power than it should at this altitude. 3/4 of a mile. Grade increased to 24%. Sullivan pushed throttle to maximum. Engine RPM 1800. Speed 9 mph. Temperature 210 degrees, 215 degrees, 220 degrees. This was where Morrison's tank had stopped, where the engine overheated and seized, where Walsh died from German artillery. Sullivan watched the temperature gauge. 220 degrees, 222, 223, climbing but not spiking. The modified coolant mixture with 65% glycol had a higher boiling point. 235 degrees instead of 212. The coolant wasn't boiling yet. The engine kept running. Tank USA 3064823 climbed past Morrison's failure point, past the scorch marks on the pavement, past the spot where 3 tankers died. The Sherman was still moving, still climbing, still producing power. Sullivan allowed himself one word over the intercom. "Holy..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. The modification was working. Callahan's Nebraska tractor trick was working on a 33-ton tank in Italian mountains. 1 mile into the climb. Elevation gain, 450 feet. Tank still climbing. Speed holding at 8 to 9 mph. Engine RPM 1800. Temperature gauge 220 degrees and rising. 222, 225, 227. The engine sounded different than standard Shermans. Rougher, more aggressive. The rich fuel mixture created a deeper exhaust note. Sullivan could hear it even inside the sealed crew compartment. The Ford GAA was working at maximum output. Every cylinder firing, every combustion cycle producing power. The modified carburetor jets were flowing 18% more fuel. The advanced distributor timing was igniting it 5 degrees earlier. Physics was working exactly how Callahan predicted. Mile marker 1.3. The second critical section. 32-degree grade, the steepest section on Highway 65. 400 yards of nearly vertical climbing. The section that stopped every Sherman that attempted it. The section where engines seized and crews died. Sullivan was already in first gear. Lowest gear available. No lower gear to shift to. Only option. Maintain throttle, maintain momentum. Pray the engine held together. Grade transitioned from 24% to 32 degrees. The change was abrupt, violent. The tank's nose pitched up. Sullivan felt the weight shift backward, felt the suspension compress, felt gravity trying to pull 33 tons back down the mountain. He kept the throttle at maximum. Engine RPM, 1800. Speed dropped immediately. 8 mph, 7 mph, 6 mph. Temperature gauge jumped. 225 degrees, 230 degrees, 232 degrees. Riley's voice, tense now. Temps in the red, Sarge. 230 degrees. Sullivan. Engine still pulling. We keep going. Marks. What if it seizes? Sullivan. Then we bail out and walk back. Rather walk than die. The Sherman's speed stabilized at 6 mph. Barely moving, crawling up a 32-degree grade at walking pace. But moving. The engine was screaming. 1800 RPM in first gear, every component stressed to maximum. Pistons hammering, valves opening and closing 80 times per second. Crankshaft spinning, camshaft rotating, fuel spraying through enlarged carburetor jets, spark plugs firing with advanced timing. Coolant circulating through passages, absorbing heat, transferring it to the radiator. Temperature, 232 degrees, 233 degrees, 234 degrees. Standard coolant would be boiling violently at 212 degrees. The engine would have seized already. But Callahan's modified mixture had a boiling point of 235 degrees. 1 degree margin remaining. 234 degrees, holding, not climbing further. The cooling system was at equilibrium. Heat production matched heat dissipation. The engine was at maximum thermal load, but stable. Sullivan gripped the steering levers, watched the temperature gauge, watched the road ahead, watched the grade start to decrease. 32 degrees to 30 degrees, to 28 degrees, to 24 degrees. Speed increased. 6 mph, 7 mph, 8 mph, 9 mph. Temperature began dropping. 233 degrees, 231 degrees, 228 degrees. The Sherman had climbed the impossible section. The section that killed Morrison's crew. The section that stopped 17 tanks in 16 days. The section the Army said couldn't be climbed. Sullivan exhaled. Realized he'd been holding his breath for the past 3 minutes. His hands were shaking on the steering levers. Adrenaline, relief, disbelief. Mile 2. Grade continuing to decrease, now 18%. Speed increasing to 12 mph. Temperature dropping to 220 degrees, then 215 degrees. Engine still running strong, no warning lights. No unusual vibrations, no sounds of mechanical failure. The tank climbed for another 2 miles, grades varying between 8% and 22%. Nothing the modified Sherman couldn't handle easily. Temperature fluctuated between 200 degrees and 220 degrees. Never exceeded 225 degrees. Never approached the critical threshold. Mile 4. Summit position. Elevation, 4,200 feet. Total elevation gain, 1,800 feet. Sullivan reached the position where Lieutenant Morrison was supposed to arrive on October 12th. The position Morrison never reached because his tank couldn't climb. The position that cost 3 lives. Sullivan stopped the tank, set the brake, let the engine idle. Temperature gauge, 218 degrees, dropping slowly as the engine cooled under reduced load. The Ford GAA was still running, still producing power, still functional after 23 minutes of maximum load climbing. 0 mechanical failures, 0 power losses, 0 stalls. 1 successful climb of terrain the Army classified as impossible for armor. Sullivan keyed the intercom. "Everybody okay?" 3 confirmations. Riley, Marks, Chen, all alive, all uninjured, all witnesses to something the Fifth Army said couldn't happen. Sullivan sat in the driver's seat for 30 seconds, just breathing, processing what they'd accomplished. Then he released the brake and began the descent. Different challenge. Controlling 33 tons down a mountain road, using engine braking, using transmission, using the brake system carefully to avoid overheating the brake fluid. The descent took 26 minutes. Sullivan drove carefully. No mistakes, no rushing. Controlled the speed, never exceeded 15 mph. Used first gear for engine braking on the steepest sections. Used the service brake only for speed control. They reached the base of Highway 65 at 17:15 hours. Sullivan turned the tank southeast toward the motor pool, 8 miles back. Callahan would be waiting, wondering if his modification worked or if 4 more men were dead on a mountain road. Sullivan drove at moderate speed. 20 mph on flat sections, 15 mph through turns. Engine temperature returned to normal, 180 degrees. Oil pressure normal, no warning indicators. The tank performed exactly like a standard Sherman, except for one critical difference. It had climbed a mountain that killed 17 other tanks. Tank USA 3064823 rolled into the motor pool at 17:17 hours. Callahan was standing near the maintenance depot, trying to look casual, failing. His face showed tension, fear, hope. He'd been waiting alone for 97 minutes. 97 minutes wondering if his modification killed 4 men. Wondering if he'd destroyed government property. Wondering if he'd solved the problem or made it catastrophically worse. Sullivan shut down the engine, climbed out of the driver's hatch. His legs were shaking, adrenaline wearing off. He walked directly to Callahan. 3 words. "Your tractor trick works." Callahan felt relief flood through him. Physical, overwhelming. "How well?" Sullivan. "We climbed the entire section, all 4 miles. Every grade including the 32-degree section where Morrison died. Engine never stalled, never lost power. Temperature got hot, 230 degrees at the worst point. But your coolant mixture kept it from boiling." Callahan. "Any engine damage?" Sullivan. "Ran smooth the whole time. You can inspect it, but it felt strong from the driver's seat." Callahan performed immediate inspection. Opened the engine deck. Checked oil level, normal. Checked for leaks, none visible. Started the engine. Listened to the idle. Rough but consistent. Checked the spark plugs. Slightly darker than standard. Evidence of rich fuel mixture. Expected result. Checked compression by ear. All 8 cylinders sounding equal. No mechanical damage. Engine condition, good. Modification assessment, successful. Legal status, still completely unauthorized. Problem, what happens next? Sullivan solved that problem by walking directly to Major Holbrook's office. Didn't ask Callahan's permission, didn't consult anyone. Just marched to battalion headquarters and requested immediate meeting with the battalion commander. Holbrook was in his office, reviewing casualty reports from another failed infantry assault on Monte Battaglia. More men dead without armor support. He looked up when Sullivan entered. "What is it, Sergeant?" Sullivan stood at attention. "Sir, request permission to report unauthorized equipment test." Holbrook's expression changed. Interest, suspicion. "Unauthorized?" "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Callahan modified a tank's fuel system. I tested it on Highway 65 this afternoon. Climbed the full section, 4 miles. All grades, including the 32-degree section. Engine performed successfully. 0 failures." Holbrook stood up slowly. "Callahan modified a tank without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "And you tested it without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "And you're reporting this instead of hiding it because it worked, sir. First Sherman to successfully complete that climb since we reached the Apennines. If Callahan's modification can make our tanks climb mountains, the Fifth Army's armor can actually support infantry instead of sitting useless at base while soldiers die." Holbrook stared at Sullivan, trying to determine if this was real or if Sullivan had lost his mind. "Where's Callahan now?" "Motor pool, sir." "Get him and bring that tank. I want to see this modification personally. And Sergeant?" "Yes, sir?" "You and Callahan better hope this isn't some insane story, because unauthorized modification of combat equipment is court-martial territory." Sullivan retrieved Callahan. Both men reported to the motor pool with Tank USA 3064823. Holbrook arrived with Motor Officer Captain Frank Harrison and Engineering Officer Lieutenant William Pierce. 3 officers, 2 unauthorized personnel, 1 modified tank. Harrison inspected the carburetors, found the enlarged main jets, measured them with calipers, 0.065 inches instead of 0.055 inches. His face showed disapproval. "This violates technical manual specifications." Pierce checked the distributor timing. 15 degrees before top dead center, 5 degrees advanced from standard. Timing exceeds authorized parameters. Pierce tested the coolant mixture. 65% ethylene glycol. Non-standard mixture ratio. Harrison summarized. "This tank has 6 separate violations of Army Technical Manual specifications." Holbrook's response? "Does it work?" Sullivan. "Yes, sir. I climbed 4 miles of Highway 65. Engine never failed. Reached the summit position." Holbrook looked at Callahan. "Sergeant, you modified Army equipment without authorization." Callahan. "Yes, sir." "You could face court-martial for destruction of government property." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Callahan's answer was simple, honest. "Because tankers were dying, sir. The Shermans couldn't produce enough power at altitude to climb mountain grades. I knew how to increase power output, used the same principles my father used on farm tractors in Nebraska. Richer fuel mixture, advanced timing, modified coolant. The modification works. The question is whether the Army wants tanks that can climb mountains or wants to court-martial the mechanic who figured out how to make it happen." Holbrook stared at him for 15 seconds, then made his decision. "Captain Harrison, I want an immediate field test under official supervision. Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours, same climb. Sergeant Sullivan drives," I observed from the command cupola. "You and Lieutenant Pierce follow in a jeep. If this modification works like Sullivan claims, we're implementing it across the entire battalion." Harrison. "Sir, this is unauthorized." Holbrook. "I don't care. I've lost 17 tanks and 22 men attempting mountain climbs. If some farm kid from Nebraska solved the problem with carburetor jets and timing adjustments, then we're using his solution. Test it tomorrow. If it works, document it. If it fails, we'll deal with Callahan then." 0800 hours, October 30th, 1944. Highway 65, Tank USA 3064823 with Sullivan driving. Holbrook in the command cupola. Harrison and Pierce follow me. Following in a jeep. Official test of unauthorized modifications under battalion command supervision. The climb repeated Sullivan's results from the previous day. All 4 miles, all grades. Temperature peaked at 231 degrees during the 32-degree section. But the tank climbed without stopping, without stalling, without failing. Holbrook experienced it firsthand, felt the tank maintain momentum on grades that stopped every other Sherman, watched the temperature gauge approach but never exceed critical limits, watched Sullivan handle the modified tank with confidence, watched an impossible climb become possible. They reached the summit at 0853. Holbrook climbed out of the command cupola, looked back down the road they'd climbed. 4 miles, 1,800 feet. Every grade that killed Morrison's crew, every section that failed 17 tanks. They'd just driven up it in 53 minutes without mechanical issues. They returned to base at 10:45 hours. Holbrook called immediate staff meeting. Harrison, Pierce, Callahan, Sullivan. Major Holbrook's opening statement was deliberate and direct. Sergeant Callahan, you violated regulations. You modified equipment without authorization. You endangered a crew during unauthorized testing. Callahan, standing at attention. Yes, sir. You also solved a problem that's cost this battalion 17 tanks and 22 killed. Captain Harrison, can this modification be safely applied to other tanks? Harrison hesitated. Technical manuals said no. Test results said yes. Sir, technically it violates specifications, Holbrook interrupted. I didn't ask about specifications. I asked if it's safe. Harrison, based on test results, yes, sir. Engine performed within acceptable parameters. Temperature was elevated but controlled. No mechanical damage occurred. Lieutenant Pierce, how long to apply these modifications to our entire tank battalion? Pierce calculated. 63 tanks, sir. If we train mechanics properly, approximately 4 days. Each tank requires roughly 2 hours' work. Callahan, can you teach other mechanics your modification procedure? Yes, sir. Holbrook made his decision. Here's what happens. Callahan, you're reduced in rank to corporal for unauthorized modifications. Consider yourself fortunate I'm not court-martialing you for destruction of government property. Yes, sir. You're also assigned to train every mechanic in this battalion on your modification. We're applying it to every Sherman by November 5th. Then we're taking those tanks up Highway 65 and we're pushing German forces off Monte Battaglia with armor support. Captain Harrison, Lieutenant Pierce, make it official. Document this as field expedient altitude compensation. Send specifications to Division Engineering. If this works for 1st Armored, it'll work for every tank unit in Italy. The farm kids. The farm tractor trick had just become official United States Army doctrine. 4 days to modify 63 tanks. Then they'd test whether mountains could stop German defensive positions any better than they stopped modified Shermans. October 31st through November 3rd, 1944. 1st Armored Division motor pool operating 24 hours daily. 18 mechanics learning Callahan's modification in rotating shifts. Each tank required 2 hours. Carburetor jets enlarged from .055 to .065 inches. Distributor timing advanced from 10 to 15 degrees. Coolant mixture changed to 65% glycol. By November 3rd, 63 tanks modified. 0 cost per tank. Total time investment, 126 man-hours. Performance improvement, 32% power increase at altitude. November 6th, 1944, 0630 hours. 63 modified Shermans forming up at Highway 65. Objective, Monte Battaglia. The same target that failed on October 12th when 3 tanks couldn't climb and 3 tankers died. Sullivan's tank USA 306-4823 led the assault. All 12 tanks in lead element climbed successfully. Temperature peaked at 231 degrees during the 32-degree section. Every tank reached the summit. 0 mechanical failures. 0 tanks stopped by terrain that killed 17 others 3 weeks earlier. The battle lasted 4 hours. German forces withdrew by 11:45. American casualties, 11 wounded, 0 killed. German casualties, 67 killed, 140 captured. First successful armor-supported mountain assault in the Italian campaign. November 15th, 5th Army issued Technical Bulletin 544. Official title, Field Expedient Altitude Compensation for M4 Series Tanks. Author credit, Corporal James R. Callahan, 1st Armored Division. By December 1st, 437 Sherman tanks in Italy modified. By January, implementation spreading to Burma, China. By February, Ford Motor Company incorporating Callahan's modification into production specifications. New Shermans rolling off Detroit assembly lines with factory-installed altitude compensation. Results quantified. Pre-modification success rate, 0%. Post-modification success rate, 97%. Casualties decreased 68%. 5th Army advance accelerated by average 12 days per objective. Callahan restored to Staff Sergeant rank March 1945. Received Bronze Star April 1945. Citation: for meritorious achievement in development of field expedient modification resulting in significant improvement to armored vehicle performance and preservation of American lives. Discharged November 1945. Returned to Nebraska. Took over family farm. Married Margaret Collins, June 1947. 4 children. Farmed until retirement 1982. When asked about the war, Callahan's standard response: just used what my father taught me about tractors. Same principles work on tanks. James Callahan died February 19th, 2003. Age 82. Buried with military honors at Otoe County Cemetery. Modern military vehicles incorporate altitude compensation as standard. Electronic fuel injection, turbocharged engines, advanced cooling. But the Sherman in 1944 had none of that. Just carburetors, distributor, coolant, and one farm kid who understood how to make them work better. That's how innovation happens in war. Not through official channels. Through mechanics who remember their father's lessons. Through soldiers willing to break regulations to save lives. James Callahan made 63 tanks climb impossible mountains using enlarged jets, advanced timing, and modified coolant. 2 hours of work, $0. Hundreds of lives saved. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten histories. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These men deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.